coming. It's great to have so many of you here. We especially welcome those of you who are not students. It's great to have you here on our campus. It's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Professor Jay Hargis is the fearless leader of our social science program right now. He's our social science division chair. He has been a professor here for 8 years, if I'm counting right, as of 9. Oops, I didn't count right. As a full-time professor, but he's been with us as an adjunct for many, many, many years before that. We won't say how many. And I got to know him personally as when he was teaching at Bartlett some years ago. My oldest daughter, whom we had groomed very carefully to focus on her mother's career path to be a nurse, had Mr. Hargis in 7th grade, and she's now history. She went on to major in history, and she changed when she had Mr. Hargis in 7th grade. She didn't have any in 7th. But anyway, whatever. That's when she changed. Whatever. She probably had both. But anyhow, Mr. Hargis has a bachelor's in history from UCLA, a master's degree in history from Chico State, and after that, since then has gone to Mexico and Latin America, but largely to Mexico for research. Many times, several of the summers that I've known him, he's spent in Mexico doing research. And so it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Professor Jay Hargis.
You don't know which one to carry. Well, thank you for coming out on Friday night. Glad to see all of you here. Tonight we're going to be looking at events that happened 100 years ago. And this is part of, I think this is the 9th presentation I've done for starting Latino History Month, which always starts on the 15th of September, which is the night before Mexican Independence Day. So today we're going to be talking about the U.S. intervention in Mexico during the Mexican Revolution. And so there'll be a little bit of background. We'll zip through a lot of slides, and I was telling Professor Osborne before we started that there's so much on this topic that I decided to make this part 1. And then part 2, we'll pick up on the 100th anniversary of the Pershing punitive expedition to chase Pancho Villa in about 1.5 years. So come on back in 1.5 years for part 2. Although there's some parts of it in here just in case. So anyway, so let's see if this works. The Mexican Revolution is the biggest event in Mexican history. It lasted an entire decade. Many famous names and characters you'll recognize if you saw it: Pancho Villa, Emiliano Zapata, Carranza, a whole bunch of other people, but it is certainly the event in Mexican history. And the United States, as a neighbor, found it very difficult not to get involved. For a variety of reasons that the United States finds it difficult not to get involved in world affairs today. There are interests at stake, there is disorder when we like order for business and for other kinds of things. And so the Mexican Revolution will tempt the United States to get involved in a number of different ways. In this case, though, we're going to talk about 3 ways in which the U.S. got involved. I call it a play with 3 acts. Number 1 is the interference in the revolutionary government, which led to the downthrow of President Madero and then his assassination. The U.S. is directly involved in that one. The second one is the U.S. Navy occupying the port of Veracruz, which is the focus of tonight's presentation. And then the third one is the response to Pancho Villa's attack of Columbus, New Mexico in March 1916, and then we sent troops 400 miles into Mexico trying to find him. So those are the 3 that we're going to be looking at here. Of course, the Mexicans were not happy about this. Before we can start with the revolution, we got to talk about why did the revolution occur. In this case, Mexico had a dictator for approximately 35 years, and his name was Porfirio Diaz. Very popular. There he is with President Taft when they met at the border in about 1910, which was Mexico's centenary of their independence. And it would also be, of course, the first year that the revolution breaks out. But he was a hero from the war against the French, the Cinco de Mayo battle. So that's all the medals. And everybody loved him, by the way, including Americans, because he predominantly protected American properties in Mexico. Many Americans, in the stability of the dictatorship, had invested in Mexico. They bought land, ranches, mines. People had put retirement homes there like they're doing now. And the government of Mexico actually had set up a police force just to protect foreigners and their investments from Mexicans. So they were actually, they benefited from this and had advantages that ordinary Mexicans didn't have. Most American businessmen thought he was a better president than President Taft or President Roosevelt before that, because they had helped, they had started in progressive legislation regulating businesses and going after monopolies. But in Mexico, they could do what they wanted to, and they were protected. So they really thought that he was the greatest. Approximately 35 years. You start picking up people who are unhappy about that. And in this case, Diaz had given an interview to an American journalman called Creelman, and in 1908, and he said, Mexico probably might get ready for real democracy. It hasn't been prepared for democracy for years, and that's the reason why I stayed on and been reelected and reelected. And he said, maybe in 1910, Mexico will be ready. Well, that was a mistake. That was meant for Americans, to make Americans feel good about him, but it was read by Mexicans, and so Mexicans decided to challenge him. And so an anti-re-election party came about, led by a man from northern Mexico named Francisco Madero. And here's Madero. Madero was educated at Berkeley and at the Sorbonne in France. He was not very macho. He was about 5'4", and he was kind of a spiritualist in the sense that he was always looking to get in touch with the spirits. He was the son of a hacienda owner, so he had a lot of money. And he seems to be very unlikely to be the kind of person that would overthrow a big dictator, but he did. He began his revolt. He actually ran for president, and Diaz locked him up. And then automatically Diaz won, always by a tremendous amount. And then he released him. He said, I'll let the pipsqueak go because I'm not worried about him. And he managed to get to the United States, where he issued a plan, the plan of San Luis Potosí, and that was to start the revolution on the 20th of November, which is a holiday in Mexico, 1910. So 100 years ago and 104 years ago, where we are now almost. Well, I'm going to go back just on one here. On this picture, you see here, not only do you see Madero, who's highlighted on this, but if you look I need to do this. Up here, that's Pancho Villa up there, his earliest supporters. He was a bandit who decided that he wanted to join the side of the overthrowing the government. And so he got involved. He's not very important at this point. The most important military person is right here. His name is Pascual Orozco, but we don't need to know anything about him. Besides the anti-re-election forces, there were other forces that wanted to overthrow the government as well, and the most famous is Emiliano Zapata, the one in the center here, whose name still is magic. The people that are resisting the current Mexican government still call themselves Zapatistas. And he also was about the only incorruptible person in the entire revolution. So he has a reputation that people today would like to link themselves to. But his program was land and liberty. They wanted to get the lands back that had been taken from them a generation or two before that. And where he lived in the state of Morelos, south of Mexico City, it was sugarcane fields, and all the sugarcane plantations were owned by rich Mexicans and foreigners, and of course all the local people had nothing. They were really campesinos or just workers, peons, who had no property. So he would lead a movement, a real social revolution, to change the economic and social conditions of the poor people in Mexico. Made American corporations very nervous in Mexico. They didn't mind the democracy stuff, but this stuff made them nervous. The revolution started. The discovery of how to win it was control the border with the United States. Why do you think that might be important? It's very similar to why the drug gangs control the border area today. What's crossing the border? In this case today, it's drugs going one way, but what's going the other way?
Arms.
Guns. It's the same thing. If you control the border with the United States, you have access to weapons. And the U.S. then, as well as today, was the #1 world's arms manufacturer and distributor. And so the rebels started their revolt in the north. They grabbed Ciudad Juarez, which is right across the river from El Paso. And the battle that was fought there, you see at the bottom, you see Americans sitting on top of a hotel watching the battle. And occasionally bullets would fly over and strike near them. Later on in other battles in the north, people would actually get hit. But in this case, it was just scenery and people selling beer and stuff like that, watching the battle. But once they won, the rebels won in the north, Porfirio Diaz decided to call it quits. He realized that he couldn't control the border, and so he left Mexico in May of 1911. And he was picked up by a British warship, by the way, and since Mexico had been where Britain had gotten the oil for its navy, and was taken to England, and then later he moved to Paris, and he's buried in Paris today. So he's an interesting character, the one with the top hat there.
So he left by way of water?
Yeah, the Navy took him out.
Okay.
There's actually a video clip that you can find online of him on the back of a train waving at everybody. And because movies were just coming out at that time. And also, he also was famously said to say, Madero has, is riding, Madero has unleashed the tiger, let's see if he can ride it. In other words, can he control Mexico? And the answer to that will be no. So this is a famous painting, by the way, this is a mural by Orozco showing Madero riding in triumph, representing the triumph of the revolution. And in this picture, though, the seeds of disaster are shown. In this corner right here, you see these two dark characters, and they are plotting his overthrow. One of them is the U.S. ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson. And so we'll hear more about him in a moment. But Madero comes into power and tries to set up a democratic government. And the Americans especially are unhappy that he's not protecting property the same way that Diaz did. So here's the U.S. impression of the whole thing. Somehow we've got to sit on this or it's going to get out of control. There's a series of cartoons you'll see in the course of this. It shows the many different reactions of the United States to disorder and their neighbors. Traditionally in much of American history, Canada has been nice and quiet, and Mexico has been nice and quiet, so the United States likes that. And so in this case, though, the Mexican Revolution seemed to be over, but it would actually continue for another 9 years. Here's our ambassador, Henry Lane Wilson, ambassador, Republican appointee of President Taft. He was related to newspaper interests in Washington State. He definitely looked down upon the Mexicans, and he also was very close to Porfirio Diaz and could not imagine why Diaz ever left. From the moment that he met Madero, he was tearing him down, reporting back to Washington, the man's an idiot, we can't trust him, let's get rid of him. And he tried to talk other diplomats in other countries to back him up to do this, but nobody would follow his lead. What he did do, though, was he helped to start the overthrow of the Madero regime, and this took place in 1913. It's called the 10 Tragic Days, La Decena Tragica, and the fighting would take place in Mexico City. Madero was a nice person, and he was so nice that he kept on the people who had fought against him on the federal side when he was a rebel, and he dismissed his own forces. Not particularly smart, but he had good intentions, and the problem was that his own generals conspired to destroy any troops loyal to him, and that's what you see going on right here. And then they would gather together, and they actually met under the auspices of the American ambassador and signed something called the Pact of the Embassy, which says, okay, we'll overthrow Madero, you get to be president first, you get to be president second. And the American ambassador would be happy because he'd have gotten rid of him. So this is our first intervention. This is a clear violation of the sovereignty of Mexico. He's not supposed to be involved in politics. He's not supposed to be choosing sides. He's not supposed to be empowering one person or the other. And what they did is the general that was protecting him was General Huerta, and he arrested Madero and the vice president, Pino Suarez, and he took office as a temporary president. And that evening, Madero's wife came to a reception at the U.S. Embassy and asked Ambassador Wilson to help free her husband. And he said, oh, don't worry about it. And then she kept going on and on and on. He says, listen, I can't influence any of the events here in Mexico. Just outright lying. And as you see what's going to happen to them, eventually, once General Huerta took over, they took these two guys out of prison, the president and the vice president. They got them to sign that they had resigned. They put them in cars, they took them to another prison, and then they shot them as they got out of the cars, and then they pretended to riddle the cars with bullets from the back, claiming that an attempt had been tried to free them, and they had been killed while trying to escape. So it was rather bogus, but it was pretty brutal. And did he deserve to die? Of course not. But it was the cynical people such as Henry Lane Wilson were really partially responsible for that. And this is what we got instead. General Victoriano Huerta, one of the all-time bad guys in Mexican history. Well, he's going to wind up in a bad way, so it's okay. There's some sort of karma involved here. So General Huerta, assuming that he has the support of the United States government, because after all, he's gotten rid of this person that the American ambassador doesn't like, wires Washington and says, we have restored order. And he expects Washington to support him. Now, the Taft administration is a little queasy about this. They don't really do anything, and the other thing that's going on, and this is early 1913, The Taft administration is going out, and a new administration is coming in. And this is the Woodrow Wilson administration. Democrats replacing Republicans in this case. And so he's going to be surprised by the reaction. Huerta immediately starts doing, not just being a temporary president, he starts using the military, in fact, to demand all kinds of things in terms of getting the legislature to do what he wants. And so he becomes what he really wanted to be, which is another Porfirio Diaz, another military dictator. Kind of hard to not want people to do that, because that was the example of the successful leadership. Once he has killed President Madero, then a host of Mexicans rise up against him. And this is the next phase of the revolution. The first phase is establishing the government for political reasons. Now we have a whole, so Zapata rises up again in the south. In the north, we get Carranza, the guy with the white beard. He comes from Coahuila, which is south of Texas. We have Obregón, who rises up in Sonora, just south of Arizona. And we also get Pancho Villa, rises up in the state of Chihuahua, which is again south of Texas and New Mexico. So much of the north and the south rise up against General Huerta, and this becomes the next phase. And this group is called the Constitutionalists. And without getting too complicated, they'll work for a while until they all turn against each other. So one thing about this is almost everybody in the revolution is going to die at one time or another by gunfire. Okay. Now, what is the United States supposed to do? Here's Taft passing off the Mexican baby to President Wilson. Wilson didn't know much about Mexico. Well, in that sense, most Americans still don't know much about Mexico. They know what they think they know. And so in this case, Wilson had come to office basically saying to a friend, wouldn't it be ironic, because he was coming in as a progressive reformer, and he was focusing on domestic or American, things to change here in the American economy, which he did, and the system here. Wouldn't it be ironic, he said, if my entire administration was focused in on foreign affairs? And of course, that's what it was, including World War I. So in this case, he got stuck with this without really knowing what to do. And Taft went off very happily when he left the White House, later to become Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. At this point, though, the baby, the information has come out. People start reporting Ambassador Wilson was behind all of this stuff. So immediately, President Wilson, no relation, orders Ambassador Wilson to come home, and he's basically fired. And so throughout the entire revolution, there's no American representatives as ambassadors to Mexico, because they don't want to recognize any of the governments that come and go. It's only they waited until the 1920s before we again appoint an ambassador. So he's the last one for a long time. So President Wilson, New Jersey governor, before that president of Princeton University, former college political science professor, PhD, our first American president was at a PhD. And he was erudite. He believed he knew everything about government. He was not a compromiser, which is one of the secrets to being a successful politician, is you have to be able to compromise with people that you don't agree with or like. And Wilson basically thought, well, he's like a college professor. I know what's best for you, and you need to do it. And why should I compromise with what's right? So it made him a difficult leader for people to deal with, especially in foreign affairs. He's also a progressive, and if you remember your American history, progressives came along at the beginning of the 20th century, from antecedents before that, but if you're watching the Roosevelts on PBS this week, it's on again tonight at 8, so rush home as soon as this is over. And it's Franklin Roosevelt and the Depression is the episode tonight. So they've done all the Roosevelts, Theodore, Eleanor, and Franklin. It's really, really good. But you see what the progressive agenda was, which was to make American society work and make the industrial society be open to people who aren't necessarily at the top. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And so Wilson's a progressive. He's going to do things as president like the Clayton Act and the Federal Reserve Act especially, regulating our currency, and a number of other things. But in this case, as a progressives, one of their secrets is they believe every problem can be solved. Now, we're a little bit more cynical today. Not every problem can be solved. But people who do believe it means they're going to keep trying. I know what the answer is. I know what the solution is. It doesn't matter what you think. We're going to solve this. And that's going to be part of the problem here for Mexico, is that Mexico was not solvable by anything that the U.S. could do, other than just stay out. Unfortunately, people weren't willing to accept that. Problem one, of course, the U.S., Teddy Roosevelt had just established the policy of being the great power in the Caribbean and North and South America. The U.S., by the way, has invaded every country in North and South America at one time or another. And you wonder why they don't like us. It's not because they hate our freedoms. That's nonsense. It's because we've invaded them, and we do what we think is the right thing to do. And Teddy Roosevelt, people like Teddy Roosevelt because he got away with it, but a lot of people don't in Latin America. And this was a time in which we were losing our luster as the land of the free. And our neighbors were saying, you're also the land of the hypocrites. And in this case, he had used the military. Taft had done what we call dollar diplomacy, basically protecting American business interests in all the countries of Latin America. Wilson came in and he said, I'm going to teach Latin Americans to elect good people. Oh yeah? We can't have people that I don't like as leaders. So it's just the policy. So the U.S. has got this tradition. This is how we looked at what we had done before. Look at this. It's kind of really interesting. Here we have the Philippines under Spanish oppression. And then now the Philippines are all cleaned up. And of course, they're not talking about the 4-year war where 4,000 Americans were killed and 100,000 Filipinos, which was called the Philippine Insurrection. It was not like this. In fact, we broke, flags of truce and killed people at meetings and stuff like that, just because we could get away with it. Hawaii, we took over Hawaii, and it shows Hawaii all cleaned up, but they were a separate country. That's the first regime change in U.S. history. We took it over because our sugar planters wanted it, and they didn't want the Hawaiians to have any authority in their own country. We also have, of course, Puerto Rico, which was we took when we won the Spanish-American War, which was already, it shows under Spanish yoke, but Puerto Rico had autonomy under the Spanish and was able to do pretty much what it wanted to do. Under the U.S., it lost all of its autonomy. Still has a special relationship today. And of course, then we also have Cuba, which, if you know, we freed Cuba because Congress insisted that we free Cuba after that war. But as you know, it fell under dictators and the mafia, if you remember seeing the Godfather movies and stuff like that. It was prone to American business interests again. And of course, the last one here is Panama, which is about as notorious as you get. We created Panama because Colombia would not sell us the land for a Panama Canal. Theodore Roosevelt got all upset and called the Colombians dirty little anthropoids. And then sent the military and said, I took what I wanted. And so yes, it was an American canal, but at what price? So what was the president to do? Well, Wilson is the first president to really use non-recognition. We won't recognize you. We won't talk to you. We don't have any dealings with you. We've been doing that recently too. Which country have we not recognized? Cuba. Yes, exactly. We keep pretending that Castro is going to go away. And we're going to punish him, but all we do is make him look good, because they can blame anything that goes wrong on the United States, because they're not recognizing us. So in this case, he didn't want to recognize the Huerta regime. And so, or he could just sit on the side and wait until the right moment and then use force. So there was a lot of calls for the United States to intervene. Stop the disorder, step in, fix the problem. But at the same time, Wilson said, well, maybe we can just get them to do our way if we simply just tell them, you've got to do things that we want, and then we'll recognize you. And here's another one. What's he supposed to do? In this case, it's force, is what they're suggesting. Put a lot more pepper in it, because Mexican food is spicy, it says. So Wilson as the cook, the unhappy cook. Here's even more, actually, to think about this, kind of a really brutal one. This is showing the U.S. about to shoot the mad dog of Mexico. And he's doing it because he has to do it. The Monroe Doctrine is keeping all those other foreign powers away, so it's the U.S. role to fix the problems in the New World. So we might as well just shoot that old dog, rather than try to fix the problem. But that's how the U.S. saw itself at this time. Wilson's response, send gunboats, send ships. Well, it's kind of like sending drones. You don't have to put people in danger. And the gunboats, and the Navy, remember, was the big service, and it was the big sign of power in those days. So send the ships off the coast and have them, the Ambassador Wilson had actually told the President Madero that if he didn't do what we wanted to, the ships would bring troops and we would take over. So President Wilson used the troops again to try to, and it shows them looking, and it shows the Mexicans paying attention to them. Now, here we come to one of the strangest things in this whole story. This is the so-called Tampico incident. Tampico is just south of the Texas border on the Mexican coast. And it was, at this time, General Huerta, the federal forces are fighting against the constitutionalists under Carranza. One into town, the constitutionalists, the other into town, the federals. The Americans are used to coming into the port of Tampico, and so 9 sailors wander in and go to a gasoline dump to get some gasoline. And the local federal forces say, what are those gringos doing here? And so they arrested them and locked them up. Meanwhile, they telegraphed to Mexico City saying, we got some gringo sailors who just came in here. What are we supposed to do with them? And the wires burned very quickly, released them right away and apologized, which is exactly what they did. But at this case, Admiral Mayo, who was in charge of the squadron right there at Tampico, said, that's not good enough. Not only do you have to return the men, which they were already back by this time, and not only do you have to apologize, but you must lower the Mexican flag over your customs office, which is the symbol of the Mexican, collect taxes there, raise the American flag over it, and give us a 21-gun salute. After all, you're just Mexicans. This is the U.S. Navy. You can't mess with us. And this is the kind of thing, this kind of crazy ramping this thing up meant that all the Mexicans basically said, wait a minute, we're not going to do that. And the General Huerta wired back and said, yeah, we'll do that, but you have to give us a 21-gun salute too. And he said, I'm not going to do that. They're just Mexicans. And so people have suddenly ramped this thing up into something that it really wasn't. It was just 9 guys who wandered into the wrong place at the wrong time. And now it's like, you have to apologize, you have to grovel to us, you have to do all of this. And so the Tampico incident got out of control. The president was in a quandary. If he doesn't respond to this insult to the United States, he's going to look weak. So Wilson's political considerations will play a major role in this. So they're looking for a way, how do we respond? You know, do we go nuclear? I mean, do we go down there and attack them, or do we send the Navy in, or whatever? And then they found an excuse. The Ipiranga is a German ship, and it's on its way to the port of Veracruz, and it's full of weapons. Now, not weapons of mass destruction. These are small arms. But the idea is those weapons are going to get to Huerta's forces, and we don't like Huerta. We don't like the other guys either, but we like Huerta less than everybody else. So let's prevent those weapons from being landed. That's an appropriate response to the Tampico incident. We're going to intercept this ship, we're going to occupy the port of Veracruz, and we're going to show those Mexicans we mean business. They didn't know the whole story, which we'll get to in a minute. Anyway, so the Navy comes down, and with a number of its ships, this is ships in the harbor there, the number of cruisers and a couple of small, there's a battleship or two there. And so they come down on April 21st, 1914, and they come down there, and the local council, the American council in Veracruz, because it's the major East Coast port of Mexico, he's been told what to do. So he goes to the Mexicans and says, we're really just going to come down and occupy the customs house. Nobody's going to be hurt, you know, and just, if you're cool and we're cool, nothing's going to happen. And the Mexican officer said, and then he went away and telegraphed Mexico City and others, and they said, well, don't get involved with the gringos. But they said, wait a second, this is Mexico. We're not going to roll over for the gringos. So here we see the forces coming in the harbor. That's going past the old fort of San Juan de Ulloa, which the U.S. shelled in the U.S.-Mexican War about 67 years before that, in our first attack on Mexico, when we landed and captured Mexico City. And here they are. This is the actual landing on the pier by the U.S. Navy. Now they sent in the Navy blue jacket divisions of sailors that they armed, and they also sent in the Marines. They had Marine detachments as well. And so they landed. The purpose was to grab the docks. And the first Mexicans they met on the docks tried to shoo them away, even though the official person that had been there had left. And the others, young officers, said, we're not going to give up the docks to the Americans. And the local naval college, they're not going to, the cadets didn't want to give it up either. So guess what? A firefight started. And, but basically, the U.S. had enough forces that we were able to take the city within a couple of days. And but what happened was 5 Americans got killed right away, and because they were shot while standing right on the pier, and from Mexican sharpshooters that were nearby. And when this news got to the admiral, he was appalled. Americans killed, they weren't supposed to do that. And it got to the White House, and Wilson was just sick. We were told that they would allow us to land. Don't they get this is just this is a statement of American power? It sounds so naive to read all of this, but when you're going to do these kinds of things, you're going to get in harm's way. But this was the first time we had done this in a long time. So anyway, this is a monument today in Mexico of the small number of people that stayed and fought. They were overwhelmed eventually. It's the first place I went to. There's a couple of monuments to the resistors of the American invasion. You find these throughout Mexico, by the way. There's a whole museum in Mexico City called the Museum of the Interventions, and the U.S. has like 4 or 5 rooms in there for all the times they invaded Mexico. And they have things like from the Alamo, and they have things from the U.S. occupation of in the 1847 invasion and stuff like that too, as well as the Pershing expedition. This just shows the harbor, and they came into, oh, I got this. They came in here and they were occupying, this is the main terminal here, this is the railroad station, which was terribly important. There was a hotel right here, and the Naval College is right here. There was a prison that the Mexicans let the prisoners out, and they started shooting at the Americans too, because they were military prisoners. And so they felt they'd get a better deal if they proved that they were good patriots. And here's the Navy in action. One of the rare photographs of Mexican soldiers fighting back. There was very few of them that were there, and they remember that these soldiers, most of them had been involved in war for a number of years, so they weren't like ordinary. These guys were veterans, and they had been fighting in the Revolution. Again, here we have again Mexicans with a sailor. In this case, the one thing that we didn't figure happened, and that was all Mexican factions got mad at us. Nobody was on our side. It's kind of like invading Iraq. Nobody's on our side, right? The people that we're coming to protect, even they're not on our side. Only Pancho Villa, of all people, was the only one who was pro-American. And he said, fine, I don't mind if you take Veracruz, that's great, because that was Carranza's forces, and he was now fighting Carranza. So he was, with his forces, were up in Chihuahua and Durango in the northern part of Mexico. So he was not directly involved, but he said he'd always protected American property, the only Mexican revolutionary who did. And here's some Mexicans fighting again on the streets. The Marines. These kinds of things, real people get killed, not just the first 5 Americans. In the end, there were 22 Americans killed and over 70 wounded. There were about 172 Mexican soldiers killed and unknown numbers of civilians. Nobody knows how many civilians died in this. And it's what we often call the undeserving dead, in the sense that, for instance, we invade Iraq. We know how many Americans died in Iraq, but 100,000 Iraqis perhaps have died there because of the invasion. And they're undeserving. We don't count them. We only count American lives. So, but it certainly was not large numbers of Mexicans, certainly a couple of hundred at least. Again, there was a great deal of pride in this particular occupation and the things that took place. Do you know that 55 medals were given for this? The most of anything other than World War I or World War II in the 20th century. More than the Korean War, more than the Spanish-American War, more than Vietnam. It's hard to believe, but it's true. One Marine officer was so, he felt that I didn't do anything heroic. Why did I get this? He actually refused. He tried to return his Medal of Honor later on, and the War Department not only mailed it back to him and said, "You will wear it. You're ordered to wear it." So they wanted to make sure that Americans remembered this in a positive way. This shows one of the hotels there, right near the pier. And eventually, a larger force came in. They brought more Marines in from, I think Captain Lejeune, which Camp Lejeune is named after, but Captain Lejeune and more Marines came in from Panama, because we occupied Panama. We had the military there at the Canal Zone. And we also sent troops down from, I think it was Tallahassee, Florida as well. So eventually the Army came in and took the place of the Navy. Well, part part of the secret is once the initial fighting's over, there's really nothing to do. The Mexicans are basically ordered not to come anywhere near the Americans. The Americans, in this case, they're just souvenir hunting, as this is labeled. But what did the soldiers do and the sailors do while they were there? They cleaned the city up, basically. They killed off mosquitoes, which they had learned to do in Panama. They cleaned the streets up. They said, we're going to show those Mexicans how to run a city. And so it was to keep them busy, essentially, because there was nothing going on for much of the period of the occupation after the initial battle. And this shows the Navy going out and the Army coming in, but it's it's not a very good picture because it's a postcard. Now, in the midst of all of this, Huerta realizes that the handwriting's on the wall. The United States is occupying Veracruz. It's mainly doing it to try to get rid of him. And Veracruz is where Mexico gets most of its money. Ships coming in and paying import taxes and export taxes out of Veracruz. Well, the U.S. bottling up the harbor. The only other thing is then you have a West Coast port, but you don't get anywhere near the trade that you're getting from the East Coast. All the oil goes out through Veracruz. So economics were against him. The fact that the U.S. did not support him, and he had expected U.S. support, and so eventually he resigned. He eventually took off and left Mexico, and then tried to get back in. He wound up going to the United States, coming in through the United States, where he got arrested and thrown in jail, I think in Arizona, and eventually he died in the U.S. of cirrhosis of the liver. He was a drunk, among other things. So he paid for it. The U.S. eventually left in November 1914. And the U.S. Army, what were we supposed to do? Well, we're going to leave this as, well, I know we want to support the constitutionalist forces. So let's leave our weapons for them. And that way, when the U.S. apparently stacked weapons, and like the guys double-timed it out there really fast because they were afraid somebody might shoot them. But when they left thousands of rounds of ammunition and all kinds of guns, and those weapons were in fact used, not on us, but they were used on Carranza's enemies, in this case Pancho Villa's division of the North. And eventually that signaled that the United States now had no objection to recognizing the Mexican government. So they recognized Carranza, and of course Villa felt betrayed. He had protected our interests, he had supported our invasion, and yet the U.S. is recognizing his enemy. And so there's Villa. And earlier, this is actually an ironic photograph because there's Villa in the center standing next to the guy who's going to be chasing him, John J. Pershing on the right here. And of course, this is the guy who's going to win the Mexican Revolution before he loses his arm fighting against Pancho Villa, General Obregón. So one of Carranza's generals, there's Villa, and then there's the American. This is right at the border. And Villa was well known on the border. Everybody loved him. In fact, movie cameras followed him around. And they restaged some of their battles for American cinema. He had a contract. Now, this is where Villa comes into the story. Villa was, his forces were beaten at the Battle of Celaya in April of 1915. And there were serious battles where he did his traditional charges, but Obregón's forces had learned from what was going on in Europe, which was World War I at this point, and they had learned about barbed wire and machine guns and stuff like that, so they dug trenches, they got behind barbed wire, and they machine gunned all of his charges as they came up. So Villa lost hundreds and hundreds of men in these kind of silly charges that had worked before. Obregón's forces win. Villa goes into hiding in the mountains of Chihuahua. And eventually he gets enough of his men together, and in March of 1916, he crosses the border to a place where he's been many times, Columbus, New Mexico, which has a military base right outside of town. And his forces, he stays out of town on his side of the border, but his forces come in, they raid the town, they kill 18 Americans and burn a number of buildings. And they also shoot up a number of the soldiers coming to try to help too. Now this is the last attack on mainland America until the 9/11 happening. In fact, when I heard President Bush say we're going to get Pancho Villa dead or alive, I heard President Bush say we're going to get Osama bin Laden dead or alive, the first two words out of my mouth were Pancho Villa because we never found him. And it took a long time before they actually did find Osama bin Laden, but it took, at least a decade. So anyway, it was burned. Everybody knew it was Pancho Villa's forces. He'd also killed some other American mining engineers in Mexico at this time, too. So he now became the focus. How dare these Mexicans attack us? It's okay for us to attack them, but how dare they attack us? And this is only one of the number of border skirmishes that took place at this time. It's the most famous one, but there were a number of others in a year and a half. Okay, so here's basically, the U.S. put out a reward for them. You may have seen this poster, it's not a particularly good one. And here it shows Uncle Sam jumping the borders, they can chase Pancho Villa, who's shown as, in this case, a barefoot peasant. He had been a bandit, but he was at this point a general. He was not just a bandit. He was very sophisticated militarily, and he didn't go around barefoot or anything like that. But it's, of course, you need to make your enemy look bad. So. Again, our invasion, Carranza was happy for us to get Pancho Villa, but the problem was we weren't getting him. It was going month after month after month after month, and Carranza's kind of like, what are you doing in Mexico? And U.S. forces traveled all the way down to Parral, which is at the bottom, 400 miles into Mexico, looking for Pancho Villa. And eventually, the constitutionalist forces, Carranza, demanded that they get out and said, only way you can go is go north. And so Americans tried to go east and west. The Americans didn't want the Mexicans telling them what to do. Their military forces in Mexico. And of course, the punitive expedition had General Pershing in charge here. We had American cavalry, the entire American Army Air Force, all 4 or 6 planes. We had armored cars, which were brand new. The problem with this, our horses are used to being very well taken care of. And this is northern Mexico, and Villa's forces and all the cavalry in Mexico, they're usually tough little horses that know how to get by without a lot of water. So most of our horses would die in the first couple months of this because they weren't strong enough for fighting in Mexico. So armored cars, cavalry, airplanes, and foot soldiers marching through the desert, not particularly smart either. But we went in right after the raid in mid-1916, and we didn't come out until right about February, March 1917, and that date is very important for obvious reasons. But of course, we never found Pancho Villa. The soldiers would come in, and they would come into each little hamlet, and they'd say, okay, where's Pancho Villa? Or, ¿Dónde está Pancho Villa? The Mexicans would be there, and even if they didn't like Pancho Villa, they'd say, oh, senor, you just missed him. He was just here, but he's gone that way. Of course, he's gone this way. He actually paralleled the troops, riding on the sun side of where they were going, keeping an eye on them. And of course, they never found him. They got close one time, but they never found him. They were going in a building while he was jumping out a window in the back. He was visiting one of his many wives. Pancho Villa never raped anybody, always married them first. And he had many wives. The last one died in 1993. I actually saw her when I was in Mexico. And she was still living near Parral, and Parral is sort of like his last hacienda. He was given a lot of lands after the revolution was over, and you could still see his wife. She was still in town, she was still at the museum. So it was kind of interesting. And I've had people in my classes here whose family were mistreated by Pancho Villa. So there are some personal stories here. There were a couple of battles down in Parral. There was an American patrol that walked in the middle of a town, and they were attacked, and they ran away, and all of them were killed. And I've been to their gravesite there. There also was the 10th Cavalry, the Buffalo Soldiers. They were involved in this. They were one of Pershing's old units, so they came along. And they had a white officer who basically tried to take his men east and west through a Mexican position. A general came out and said, you can't go through here, please. And the Mexican troops were all drawn up, and this guy basically was talking to his translator. He says, tell the son of a bitch we're going through. And the Mexican understood English. So the officer walked away. He tried to force his men through this town. He was killed instantly. And almost all the officers were controlling the black troops were killed. And so a number of them without leaders took off, and these were captured. And they were stripped naked, basically, and every day they were marched out, told they were going to be shot by the Mexican forces under Carranza. But eventually, they realized it was smart not to do anything, and so we negotiated their release. But the Battle of Carrizal, again, we're fighting against revolutionary forces that have been fighting for years, and the American troops were not that, they were still pretty green in terms of actual combat experience. So the two military experiences against Mexicans were disasters during this war. As the U.S. troops are coming out, and we're kind of, when our soldiers were being held as captives, we actually sent the National Guard to the border. We were getting ready. We grabbed all the bridges across the Rio Grande River. So we're getting ready for an invasion. But then Pershing got his forces out. They came out to a big parade, and they were saying, well, Villa is not a problem anymore, kind of like what they said about Osama bin Laden at one point. So he's been, defanged. But the truth was he wasn't. And Pershing sent a private letter to his father-in-law, which he said, we're coming out with our tails between our legs. This was a disaster, this whole thing. And as we're coming out, the Zimmermann telegram is released. The Zimmermann telegram was a telegram that the German foreign minister sent to Carranza. Carranza, when he was mad at the United States and we were in Mexico, had sent to the Germans and said, you want an alliance with us? We want an alliance with you. He liked the Germans because the Germans had no demands on his territory. The British, the French, the Americans had all invaded or demanded material stuff from Mexico. And so he was looking for the Germans. The Germans were happy way off in Europe. They weren't here in the New World. And so Carranza had sent this request. The Germans responded with the so-called Zimmermann telegram. And it hit at a moment when we're feeling really bad about our experience in Mexico. And in this telegram, Zimmermann promised that if the Mexicans joined in a defensive alliance with Mexico against the United States, that Germany would give them back lost territories that they had lost to the United States in the U.S.-Mexican War in the 1840s. Texas, Kansas, Arizona, they didn't have Arizona, New Mexico, they had Texas too for that matter, I'm just kidding. But anyway, so the British had actually intercepted it. The Germans didn't think anybody could read their mail, but the Brits had it. They set it up so that they waited, they held it until a good moment. When they knew that they had a gold mine, that they were trying to get the Americans in the war. And here was something that the Americans would get upset about. And when it hit the papers, and it looked like it had been leaked from Mexico, but it wasn't. It had been leaked by the British to the Americans. And so here's the German Kaiser cutting out these states, and maybe even California going to Japan. So they're playing the race card on that too. Japan was actually an ally of the Allies during World War I, but Americans, there was a strong anti-Asian feeling here on the West Coast for a long time, which we saw manifest in World War II when Japanese Americans were locked up. That too, okay. So anyway, with the United States inflamed, and that Mexico might be helping the Germans stab us in the back, then to recover our honor, Wilson decided to ask Congress for a declaration of war on April 4th, April 2nd, and Congress declared war on April 4th. One of only 2 times we declared war in the 20th century. The rest we just fought. So the U.S. went off. Now, did the occupation, did any of this serve any good? Well, the whole time that Pershing was in northern Mexico and he was not allowed to go anywhere or do anything, he actually trained his men. And Pershing was the only U.S. military commander with current experience. So when the U.S. Expeditionary Force was sent to Europe, he was the commander. He was the only one that they could send. So his time in Mexico, and his number one aide was Captain Patton, and who had actually beat people up so he could go on to Mexico. In the occupation of Veracruz, Admiral Fletcher, his army aide was Douglas MacArthur, Lieutenant Douglas MacArthur. So who would become a general in World War I as well. So both of these experiences of Mexico would lead American leaders to the next war. And so we came out with our troops, at least some of our troops, prepared for war. Of course, what's the purpose of all of this? Did it serve any useful purpose? I would argue no. Our interventions were all unsuccessful, or they led to things that we were not anything but ashamed of, which is like the assassination of Madero. We stirred up anti-American feeling not just in Mexico, but throughout Latin America. There's a famous, we don't have a picture of it, but the Mexicans tied an American flag to a donkey's tail and led it around Mexico City, sweeping the streets. You often see people doing that, burning American flags when they're mad at us, and this was very common throughout Latin America. We didn't really know what we were doing. There were no clear goals, what we were trying to do. We simply wanted to influence events and get people to see our particular point of view. We had no exit strategies. So we stayed long months after the actual conflict was over, trying to justify it, finding a good reason to go. The U.S. involvement in Mexico directly led to our involvement in World War I. If we hadn't been in Mexico, there might not have been any real casus belli or cause of the war to lead us into World War I. Certainly was not submarines, although people seem to think it was. And of course, World War I solved no problems. It's a war that just ended without anybody being a victor or defeated. And it led to the Great Depression, and it led to World War II. Nobody won, everybody lost. So the intervention policy didn't serve us then, and the question is it serving us today? Here we are trying to, you see the guy standing on American aid? We send aid, we try to help people, we think we're doing the right thing, and what happens? We get a lot of people mad at us. So, unfortunately, do we learn anything? Any questions? Are you awake? Yes,
This is the first time, I guess, I've thought about so the Brits kind of let that Zimmerman telegram out because then they wanted the U.S. to get in. Is that part of the deal?
Yeah, you know, the first thing I thought when I heard the story of the Zimmerman telegram was the Brits must have just made it up. But the truth was, the German foreign minister actually said, yeah, I sent it, which was really stupid, but he did it anyway. And he admitted to having sent it. The Mexicans never bit on that for obvious reasons. Carranza was nice and quiet during World War I. Mexico did not do any support for us, did not do anything pro-German during the war. And, but the Zimmerman telegram is the real, it's like the straw that breaks the camel's back, and the U.S. feels that its interests are now directly being challenged. And that's the lands that we have here. So lands that we'd taken from Mexico just, 70 odd years before. Other questions? Yes?
So that telegram was held back and used at the most opportune political moment?
Absolutely. In the period after World War I, there was a lot of suspicion that it had been it was totally manufactured, that the Brits had finagled us into this war. But they had tried to get the U.S. involved, and the real reason why, and this is something I teach in my classes, is the real reason why we got involved in the war is that the United States had a financial stake in the Allies winning. The British and the French sold government bonds here in the United States, and so many Americans invested in those, and if they had lost, we'd have lost millions and millions of dollars. And the Germans, we tried to be even-handed at the beginning of the war. Wilson said we have to be neutral in thought and deed. And of course, it's hard to be neutral in thought. How do you measure that? The fact was the Germans couldn't get to us because the British put up a naval blockade to prevent, that's why the Germans went to submarine warfare, because the British had a naval blockade. So only the British and the French could get to us. We could only buy their goods. We had this tremendous financial stake in the war, and although people don't want to think about that, the war was sold to Americans. We're going to solve all the problems of the war, end all wars. It's the war that's going to save democracy. And of course, it did none of those things. But it's nice to be idealistic. So, and did the Brits finagle us? I don't know. There was another one in World War II. Franklin Roosevelt was seen in one of his speeches before Congress waving an alleged German map to take over South America. And many people believe that was a British fabrication too. So, but I don't think the Zimmerman telegram was, because the guy admitted he'd sent it. Other comments? Yes?
Go ahead. How do you see intervention or non-intervention as it relates to the so-called Islamic State?
Well, the U.S. policy towards it, when we do make decisions for intervention or not to intervene, we've always been sort of at two minds what we're supposed to do. Should we act like a great power? We are a great power. And what is it, the Spider-Man quote, to whom those are given great power, great things are expected. So if we don't do it, who's going to do it? That's one side of the debate. The other side of the debate is, should we just stand for what our values are and be like George Washington said, be friends with everybody and not try to change anybody else? When the Monroe Doctrine said we're not going to get involved in any activities in the old world. And so it's a real debate that's been part of American foreign policy for a long time. And both ways you could go are frustrating. I don't want to suggest that there isn't a correct answer. Islamic State is partly there because of what we've done. Remember, we helped create became Al-Qaeda by arming the Mujahideen against the Russians in Afghanistan. We supported Saddam against the Iranians in the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s. You know, intervention or participation in these things sometimes has blowback. And so it's very simplistic to say we shouldn't do anything. I don't think it's a good decision one way or another, but sometimes you just have to go in and do it. It's like you just have to make a decision. So whoever's president has to make a decision. You know, and Congress has to make their decision. So, I mean, I wish I had a straight answer. It's one of these things that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And we just have to understand that it's more complex than we're the good guys and they're the bad guys. So, yes.
So, really,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
well, the breakdown of the Mexicans through with the first president, when he left, that is what started it. And then Wilson actually kind of got in the way. He was standing in the background, like you say, waiting for the opportunity to get rid of this other guy. Didn't that cause a lot of problems too?
Well, you mean Wilson the ambassador or Wilson the president?
Wilson the ambassador.
That Wilson the ambassador wanted to get rid of the revolutionary guy, Madero, absolutely.
Didn't that
And,
cause a lot of,
oh yes, I mean, basically because,
the Americans,
you know, in Mexico, we forget all this stuff. You know, get over it, it's history. But it's not forgotten in south of the border. It's in every Mexican history book. It's in every museum. So, and they don't forget it. I mean, the context for it is often forgotten, but they just remember we came in and not only did we take half of Mexico, you know, 170 years before, but we came back for no good reason as far as they could see, just to intervene. Question?
Yeah, how would you compare President Wilson and President Obama in terms of how they handled their respective relationships and decisiveness about how to affect their efforts?
Well, you know, that's actually, again, that's a difficult question because Wilson didn't really know what he was doing. Okay, I know that people think President Obama doesn't know what he's doing, but he has a no-win situation as far as I'm concerned. Whatever he chooses is going to be the wrong thing, especially when you don't have a Congress that will back you up. He has tried to create a third way, which is to try to appeal to the Islamic world. And he, remember, he had lots of positive feedback at the beginning of his first term. It's just that we weren't able to sustain that. And of course, every time Israel does something, we get blamed for it. So, I mean, and people from both there's a situation that exists now that didn't exist for Wilson's time, which is the state of Israel. And politicians from both parties bend over backwards to show how much support they have for Israel, including the current president. And so it's like it is, and you expect us to be able to influence people in the region? As far as they're concerned, everything comes back to that one issue. Do you remember after 9/11, a Saudi prince came in and said, you know why you were attacked? Just because of your support for Israel. And Rudy Giuliani said, yeah, it's not true. You know, you're just fooling yourself if you think that that's not part of the equation. It's part of every equation. So it doesn't matter who's president. Doesn't matter who's president. And unfortunately, it's a no-win situation. The Kobayashi Maru on Star Trek, it's a no-win. So I just wish it was. I wish they could resolve this. We have a clear national policy to support Israel, so therefore almost anything we do anywhere in the Middle East is difficult, to say the least. And I feel for any president making a decision, whether he's Obama or whether he's Romney or anybody else. There's anybody who says they have an answer, they're either lying or they're stupid, because they don't. You had a question? We did.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask, maybe I missed it, what happened to the general who became president after Madero's assassination?
Huerta?
Yeah.
Yeah, he's the one that resigned during the occupation of Veracruz and then left. He wound up going to the United States and dying of cirrhosis of the liver in jail.
Okay.
He drunk himself to death. That's right.
Based on what we've done historically in the U.S., what are the chances of us making the same mistakes or doing the same thing again and pulling out of the Middle East for no reason or staying there for no reason? I mean, I know that, back a long time ago, our country was a lot more informed with a lot more things, and I know that today, not a whole lot of people are. And I didn't know if that usually plays into a factor in what's going on now as opposed to then.
if people were more informed, perhaps we'd have more options. I think the British just opted out of the Middle East at the end of World War II. And, you know, with the Palestine, they withdrew from the Middle East, and we stepped into the vacuum. If we stepped out, somebody else will step into the vacuum. Will it be Russia, maybe, or China?
It's a different perspective. Each country has their own
Oh, of
perspective
course.
on the matter, so it's too many things. Everybody's disagreeing because it's a different.
But we're also not, we're not in the situation that Britain was, where they were completely exhausted after World War II, and they were still on rationing, and they didn't have any food, and they had to back off their empire. Anti-colonialism was in full swing. For us to back out, we would have to completely drop Israel. And I don't see that happening anytime soon. And I'm not advocating that we should. I mean, it's something that we've made a commitment to that, and we try to be even-handed, so we give the Israelis a lot of money, we give the Egyptians a lot of money. And what have we got? We have another military dictatorship in Egypt. So, I wish, you know, I could wave a magic wand and click my heels together and we could solve all the problems. But it is when you're going to be a hegemon, which is a power in a region, a regional power, and you use your power, then you either have to do it without any conscience and just do what you has to do in your interests, or you try like we do to get people to like us while we do it, which is difficult. It's very difficult. And I wish, and even if we were informed, I'm not sure we were informed better. Even when our own allies, you know, Israel spies on us. So, and they've done it for years. It's nothing new. And there are people in the U.S. government who give them information, so. Anyway, other questions? Yes. Oh, yeah.
During all this was happening, did the U.S. ever thought about, like, forget about this, let's just leave them alone, let them do their own business? Because right now we're getting involved in other people's business, even though it doesn't involve us. Like, right now the Ukraine's asking for the U.S. versus this, but I don't know what this is.
Yeah, the Ukraine crisis is another one of these no-win situations, too. Ukraine, as you know, used to be part of the Soviet Union, and now Russia is trying to reconstitute the Soviet Union, maybe. It would be naive of us to say we can walk away. We can't walk away. When the Soviet Union collapsed, we were the last superpower. And people were triumphant. We won because we're better, it's the end of history and all this stuff. It's gotten worse since then. It's not gotten better. We aren't really sure who our enemies or our friends are anymore. And that's just my speculation. You guys are smart enough to figure this out for yourself. The Ukraine, you know, we don't want the Ukraine to be taken over by Russia, but the Ukrainian government isn't particularly nice people either. You know, it's kind of like, which of the factions in Mexico are we supposed to pick? None of them were particularly good. So the president tried to play for time, and then eventually said, well, the heck with it. I mean, the U.S. recognized Carranza because Wilson started to see that World War I was coming, and that the U.S. had to focus in on that. And it's a devil's bargain again. So you pick one side and you just hope it works. So should we just not get involved? I think as a great power, then any president who doesn't get involved in some way that we could is going to take a lot of hits. You lost China, they told Harry Truman. When Communist Chinese took over, he didn't lose China. The Chinese nationalist government lost China, but he was blamed for it because he was president and didn't nuke the communists when they took over. And that's what caused Lyndon Johnson to support Vietnam, because he was afraid people would say, you lost Vietnam. So politics, you can't ignore the politics of being a leader, whatever the president is, or whatever party he's in. Thank you for coming tonight, and keep thinking and keep learning about this stuff, and maybe you guys can help it solutions.